My name is Paige Sanders. I am 31 years old. A few hours ago, I sat at a tiny, uneven overflow table shoved directly next to the swinging kitchen doors at a luxurious Park City ski lodge. My family was hosting a lavish anniversary reunion for 100 of Utah's most influential politicians and developers. Every few minutes, a waiter rushed past me for the heavy wooden door thudding against the wall, sending a draft of cold air over my shoulders. Across the sprawling banquet hall, seated at a grand head table draped in white orchids, my mother stood up and tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp chimes silenced the room. Lorraine possessed that practiced sincerity unique to women who treat country club dinners like competitive sports. She folded her hands, lowered her chin, and leaned into the microphone. Lord, her voice echoed through the sound system. We ask for your grace to guide those who have strayed from our family path. We pray for Paige. 100 heads turned in unison. Eyes searched the cavernous room until they found me tucked away in the shadows of the service entrance. We pray she finds her way out of her difficult financial struggles and poor life choices, my mother continued, her tone dripping with rehearsed pity. We will always leave a light on for the lost. Women in tailored silk dresses exchanged knowing glances. My older sister, Audrey, smirked behind her wine glass. 5 years ago, that exact public humiliation would have sent me running for the freezing parking lot. Tonight, I just smiled. I reached into my unbranded leather bag, withdrew a thick folded piece of paper, and calmly wedged it under the short leg of my table. I set my water glass down. The wobble stopped. Pulling back the cuff of my gray cashmere sweater, I checked the time on a watch set with stones that caught the dim light. I picked up my phone and typed 3 words to my husband. Are you official? My mother thought she held the winning hand. She had no idea who I was texting. When the heavy oak doors finally opened and my husband introduced himself to the room, my father literally stumbled backward into his chair, and my sister lost all the color in her face. Before I tell you exactly what title made the entire room fall dead silent, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Zara Told Stories. I would also love to know your age and what state or country you are watching from right now. Drop it in the comments. To understand how a so-called worthless daughter brought a Utah real estate empire to its knees without raising her voice, we have to rewind. 5 years ago, the scent of expensive cigar smoke and polished leather hung heavy in my father's Salt Lake City study. Warren Sanders stood behind his mahogany desk, holding a printed background check. You want to throw away your legacy for a public defender? He asked, dropping the paper. Ethan Caldwell is a bad investment. He has debt. He has no connections. You will break this engagement, Paige, or you will pack your things tonight. I stood my ground. My hands were clammy, but my voice held steady. I love him, Dad. I am not marrying the venture capitalist you picked out just to fund your next commercial project. My father walked around the desk. His eyes were entirely hollow. To him, children were just assets to be leveraged. Then you are a liability, he said. He grabbed my arm, marched me down the grand hallway, and opened the front door. The January wind bit into my skin. He pushed me out onto the front steps. You want to choose poverty? Go learn what it feels like. He shut the door. The deadbolt clicked into place. I stood shivering in the Utah snow, with nothing but the coat on my back. I did not know it then, but being discarded was the greatest gift he ever gave me. Because while my family spent the next 5 years parading their wealth across Park City, Ethan and I were in the Silicon Slopes building something in the dark. The deadbolt slid into place with a heavy metallic thud. The sound echoed across the grand stone portico, finalizing my exile. I stood there on the icy pavement, wearing only a thin cashmere cardigan over a silk blouse. The January wind swept down from the Wasatch Mountains, biting into my exposed skin. The cold sank into my bones within seconds. I turned around to face the sprawling Salt Lake City estate. It loomed behind me like a limestone fortress, its towering glass windows glowing warmly against the dark winter sky. Through the second-floor panes, the soft light of a crystal chandelier spilled onto the fresh snow. A silhouette moved past the glass. It was my mother. She paused, looked down at me shivering on the freezing driveway, and pulled the heavy velvet drapes shut. That single, deliberate movement told me everything I needed to know about the Sanders family. Love was not a birthright in that house. Love was a conditional dividend paid out only when you performed according to the quarterly projections. My father, Warren, built his commercial real estate empire by evaluating every human interaction as a calculated transaction. He viewed his children as line items on a balance sheet. You were either an appreciating asset or a liability. My older sister, Audrey, understood this assignment flawlessly. She secured her place in the family hierarchy by marrying Spencer, a polished and entirely hollow local politician. Her marriage was a strategic alliance designed to grease the wheels for municipal zoning permits my father desperately needed. Audrey was the golden child. I was the rogue variable. My teeth chattered so hard I could barely form syllables when I dialed Ethan. He answered on the first ring. I told him I was outside. 15 minutes later, the glaring headlights of his 10-year-old sedan pierced the darkness of the gated neighborhood. The engine rattled, disrupting the pristine, engineered silence of the billionaire enclave. Ethan threw the passenger door open. Blasts of artificial heat hit my face. I climbed in, my hands shaking without control as I held them over the dashboard vents. Ethan did not ask what happened. He took one look at my empty hands, my pale skin, and the looming mansion in the rearview mirror. He shifted the car into drive. "We are never coming back here," he said. His voice carried a quiet, unbreakable resolve. He reached across the center console and wrapped his warm, calloused fingers around my trembling hand. I leaned my head against the cold window pane, watching the wrought iron gates of my childhood home fade into the falling snow. The drive down the canyon felt like crossing a border between two different realities. Up there in the high-altitude enclaves of Park City and the Salt Lake foothills, society operated on inherited power and deep vanity. It was a landscape defined by exclusive country clubs, performative philanthropy, and backroom handshake deals. My parents reigned over that kingdom. But as we descended into the valley, the glittering lights of the tech corridor came into view. This was the Silicon Slopes. It was a gritty, relentless expanse of startup incubators, server farms, and ambitious engineers fueled by caffeine and sheer willpower. Down here, a prestigious last name bought you nothing. You ate what you killed. You built your worth from scratch. This was where my future lived. The first year tested every ounce of my mental endurance. We moved into a cramped one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of bleached carpets and old coffee grounds. Ethan worked grueling 80-hour weeks at the public defender's office, fighting tooth and nail for clients the judicial system had discarded. I sat at a chipped laminate kitchen table, typing lines of code on a dying laptop. I was laying the digital foundation for a predictive healthcare analytics platform. It was a complex data model designed to identify early warning signs in patient demographics, aiming to streamline hospital triaging protocols. I called the project Vanguard Data. We married that spring on a random Tuesday. There were no imported white orchids. There was no string quartet or custom designer gown. We stood in a drab municipal courthouse illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. Ethan wore his only tailored suit. I wore a simple white dress I found on a clearance rack. An overworked clerk stamped our paperwork, charging us a standard $50 filing fee. The joy I felt in that sterile room eclipsed anything I had ever experienced in the opulent ballrooms of my youth. I did not need conditional approval. I needed a partner who saw my inherent value, and Ethan looked at me like I hung the moon. Audrey had commanded a $500,000 spectacle in the Red Rock Canyons of Moab just 2 years prior, a wedding funded entirely by my father to showcase his social dominance. My quiet courthouse elopement was an act of pure rebellion. I made a vow to myself during those early, exhausting days. I would build a life of immense success, but I would do it without a single cent of Sanders' money. I would prove that a terrible investment could yield a return they could never comprehend. The hunger in my stomach became a persistent rhythm, a metronome keeping time with my ambition. Every time a line of code failed, every time an investor ignored my email, I remembered the metallic thud of that deadbolt. I funneled the sting of rejection into my work. I learned to operate in the shadows, realizing that if my family thought I was a destitute failure, they would not view me as a threat. Invisibility became my greatest armor. The physical toll of building a startup from zero was heavy. My sleep cycles dwindled to 3 or 4 hours a night. My diet consisted mostly of stale bagels and black tea. I stopped attending social functions. I stopped buying new clothes. The tight-knit Utah society assumed I had vanished out of shame. Rumors circulated through the country club that I was living in squalor, a cautionary tale for any daughter who dared to defy the patriarchal order. My mother fueled these whispers, expertly playing the role of the tragic, heartbroken matriarch whose child had thrown her life away. Ethan became my anchor during those precarious months. When I wanted to quit, when the stress caused my vision to blur and my chest to tighten with anxiety, he would sit beside me at the laminate table. He would review my pitch decks, highlighting my strengths, reminding me of the brilliant logic behind my algorithms. He never once complained about the lack of money or the long hours. He understood the profound weight of my isolation. To be excised from your own bloodline creates a very specific type of grief. It is a mourning process for people who are still alive. You grieve the parents you deserved, but never received. You grieve the safety net that was abruptly snatched away. Ethan helped me transform that hollow grief into a sharp, focused energy. We became an insular unit, a team of two operating against a world that had written us off. But walking away from a toxic ecosystem does not mean the predators stop hunting. My father and sister were not content simply ignoring my existence. They needed me to fail. They needed my failure to validate their choices. 2 years into my startup journey, Vanguard Data was slowly gaining traction, but I was running out of capital to keep the servers online. I needed a breakthrough, or I needed a miracle. Instead, I got an encounter that would set the stage for my first real taste of corporate warfare. 24 months evaporated into a grueling rhythm of isolation and relentless focus. By my 28th birthday, my reflection belonged to a stranger. Hollow contours shadowed my cheekbones. Dark crescents lived permanently beneath my eyes. Ethan and I operated on a razor-thin margin, pouring every spare dollar into server hosting fees and legal filings for Vanguard Data. My wardrobe consisted of faded denim and oversized sweaters purchased from thrift store clearance racks. I did not care about aesthetics anymore. I only cared about the algorithm. It was a complex machine learning model designed to predict hospital readmission rates, and it was finally working. The code was elegant, running flawlessly through terabytes of simulated patient histories. I just needed to finalize the interface. That Tuesday afternoon, I sat in a crowded corner of a bustling Lehigh coffee house. The Silicon Slopes Tech Hub thrived outside the frosted windows, humming with innovation and venture capital. My ancient laptop fan whirred loudly, protesting the heavy processing load. I took a sip of bitter, lukewarm espresso, keeping my eyes locked on the glowing terminal. Then the bell above the cafe door chimed. The ambient chatter shifted. I glanced up and felt my stomach drop. Spencer strode into the room like he owned the building. My brother-in-law wore a pristine tailored navy suit that screamed inherited wealth. His hair was styled with expensive pomade, and his smile possessed the plastic, rehearsed quality of a career politician. He was currently campaigning for a state Senate seat, a vanity project funded almost entirely by my father's real estate empire. Audrey had married a puppet, a man willing to trade his spine for a prominent position in the Sanders family hierarchy. He ordered a complicated drink, turned around, and his gaze landed squarely on my table. He paused, his eyes scanning my frayed cuffs and the cracked bezel of my computer monitor. A look of profound pity washed over his features. He walked over, invading my quiet sanctuary. "Paige," he said, dragging out the syllables. "Wow, it has been a long time." I slowly closed my laptop lid, shielding the proprietary code. "Hello, Spencer." He leaned against the empty chair opposite me, crossing his arms. His cologne smelled sharp and overpowering, like pine needles and arrogance. "You look exhausted," he noted, his tone dripping with condescension. "The family worries about you, you know. Your father mentions it often. It is a shame to see you struggling like this." I maintained a neutral expression, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "I am doing just fine," I replied evenly. Spencer chuckled, shaking his head. "Right. Listen, I am expanding my campaign office next week. We need someone to manage the front desk, answering phones, sorting mail. It is minimum wage, but consider it a family favor, a stepping stone to get you out of this slump." The sheer audacity of the offer hung in the air. He wanted to parade me around his headquarters as a charity case, a living testament to his own benevolence and my supposed failure. I felt a sharp spike of anger, but I forced my facial muscles to relax. I smiled politely. "I appreciate the offer, Spencer, but I am currently employed. I do data entry. It pays the bills." The lies slipped out flawlessly. Data entry. A mundane, repetitive task that fit his exact narrative of my pathetic existence. He sighed, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Suit yourself. But the offer stands when you finally get tired of scraping the bottom of the barrel." He grabbed his drink and walked out, leaving a trail of smug superiority in his wake. I packed my bag, my hands trembling with suppressed adrenaline, and drove back to our cramped apartment. When I unlocked the front door, a stack of forwarded mail lay scattered on the linoleum floor. Most of it was junk, but one thick envelope caught my attention. The return address belonged to a private wealth management firm in downtown Salt Lake City. My pulse quickened. Before my grandmother passed away, she established a modest trust fund in my name. The stipulations dictated that the account would mature and transfer to my control upon my 28th birthday, which had occurred 3 weeks prior. I tore the perforated edge of the document. The crisp paper unfolded in my hands. I scanned the columns of numbers, expecting to see the initial deposit of $150,000 plus a decade of accrued interest. Instead, my eyes locked onto the final balance printed in bold black ink. $0.00. The air vanished from the room. A cold, heavy stone plummeted into my stomach. I traced the transaction history printed on the second page. A single sweeping wire transfer had emptied the account exactly 4 months ago. The authorization signature belonged to Warren Sanders. Because the trust was established while I was a minor, my father retained a grandfathered proxy status, giving him legal access until my birthday. He had drained my entire inheritance 90 days before I legally took ownership. I scanned the destination details of the wire transfer. The receiving account was registered to the Utah Progress Action Committee. It was Spencer's primary campaign fundraising vehicle. My father had literally stolen my future to finance my brother-in-law's political ego. I sank onto the cheap synthetic fabric of our living room sofa. The walls of the apartment seemed to tilt inward. $150,000. That money represented a secure server array, a dedicated marketing budget, and a year of living expenses. It was the crucial lifeline Vanguard Data desperately needed to scale. My own father reached into my pocket and handed my grandmother's legacy to a man who had just offered me a minimum wage job out of pity. The cruelty was not accidental. It was a calculated surgical strike meant to ensure my permanent subjugation. The front door creaked open hours later. Ethan stepped inside, loosening his faded necktie. He took one look at my rigid posture and the crumpled bank statement in my lap. He dropped his briefcase and knelt in front of me. I handed him the paper without a word. His eyes darted across the printed lines. The muscles in his jaw knotted so tightly, I thought his teeth might shatter. "This is a breach of fiduciary duty," Ethan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "It is textbook financial exploitation." "We can sue him," I whispered, my vocal cords raw. Ethan looked up, his expression painfully conflicted. "Yes, we have a case. But Warren has an army of corporate litigators on retainer. They will bury us in endless discovery motions. They will file continuances until the legal fees bleed us dry. It will take 3 to 5 years to see a courtroom." I absorbed the grim reality of the American legal system. Justice was a commodity, and my father owned the supply chain. If I initiated a lawsuit, the financial strain would bankrupt my startup within 6 months. I would lose Vanguard Data, and Warren would win. I looked at my husband, the man who spent his days fighting a broken system and made the hardest choice of my life. We do not sue. I stood up, walked into our tiny home office, and powered on the printer. I placed the bank statement on the scanner glass and created 3 high-resolution digital backups. Then I folded the original paper, walked to the closet, and placed it inside a small, fireproof metal safe. I turned the combination lock, hearing the heavy steel tumblers click into place. I locked away my anger alongside the evidence. I refused to fight them in the mud. Instead, I decided to build a mountain they could never climb. Have you ever realized your own family stole your future to fund the golden child's ego? Have you ever found the documented proof of their betrayal staring back at you in black and white? I did not scream. I did not call my father to demand an explanation. I gathered my receipts. I embraced the silence. But my family was not finished trying to erase my existence. As the winter holidays approached, my mother decided to launch a psychological strike of her own, proving that financial theft was only the beginning of their cruelty. The metal door of our small safe had clicked shut on my financial betrayal, but the emotional assault was merely reloading. December swept into the Salt Lake Valley, bringing heavy snowfall and the suffocating pressure of high society holiday expectations. Growing up, the weeks leading to Christmas were never about warmth or connection. They were a prolonged public relations campaign. My parents viewed the holidays as an opportunity to project their flawless image across Utah, hosting extravagant galas and sending out hundreds of curated greetings to business partners and political allies. I thought my exile would spare me from the seasonal theater. I was wrong. The psychological warfare simply evolved. A thick envelope arrived in our rusted apartment mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon. The paper felt heavy, embossed with gold foil edging. I recognized the return address instantly. It was penned in the sweeping, elegant calligraphy my mother hired out every winter. My thumb slid under the flap, tearing the premium paper. I pulled out a glossy, oversized photograph. There they were, standing on the pristine, sunlit terrace of a luxury ski resort. Warren, Lorraine, Audrey, and Spencer formed a tight, beaming cluster dressed in coordinated neutral cashmere. They even brought Spencer's purebred golden retriever, who sat obediently at my father's feet. But my eyes did not linger on their smiling faces. My gaze dropped to the strange, awkward gap on the far left edge of the frame. The composition of the photograph felt off, unbalanced. I looked closer, my heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Near the edge of the snowy background, right next to Audrey, a faint shadow remained. A tiny sliver of a dark wool coat had been left behind. It was my coat. They had not just taken a family photo without me. They had taken a photo with me in it. And then my mother had paid a professional retoucher to physically erase my body from the image. I was cropped out, smoothed over, and replaced by empty, white snow. The cruelty of that calculated erasure paralyzed me. I stood in the center of our cramped kitchen, the glossy cardstock trembling in my hands. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I set the card down on the laminate counter and reached into my pocket for my phone. A dreadful, sinking intuition urged me to check social media. I had avoided viewing their profiles for months, preserving my fragile mental state. But the altered photograph pushed me over the edge. I opened an app and typed my sister's name into the search bar. Audrey's profile appeared immediately. Her most recent post sat at the very top of the feed, featuring the exact same altered holiday portrait. The caption read, "The perfect, complete Sanders family, counting our endless blessings this season." The word complete hit me like a physical blow. It was not a careless adjective. It was a deliberate, surgical strike. My sister was broadcasting to her thousands of local followers that the family unit was whole, that my absence was not a missing piece, but a corrected error. I scrolled down to the comment section, my thumb shaking against the screen glass. Friends and society acquaintances left streams of heart emojis and compliments, but mixed among the praise were questions from extended relatives who lived out of state. Aunt Caroline, my mother's sister, had typed a single confused sentence. "Where is Paige this year?" I held my breath, watching my screen as I read the reply, threaded directly beneath it. It was from my mother. Lorraine had typed her response for the entire internet to witness. "Oh, Caroline," her comment read, "Paige has chosen a path of poverty. We are respecting her privacy during her difficult struggles. Please keep her in your thoughts." My vision swam. The letters on the glowing screen blurred together as a hot tear spilled over my lower lash line, tracking down my cheek and splashing onto my collarbone. My mother had weaponized polite concern, crafting a public statement designed to draw blood, while wearing a mask of maternal sorrow. She painted me as a destitute failure, a tragic cautionary tale. She knew her wealthy peers would read those words and shudder, ensuring that my reputation in Salt Lake City was entirely destroyed. It was a calculated maneuver to break my spirit and force me to come crawling back, begging for their financial mercy. The grief that followed was not born of anger, but of a profound, hollow sorrow. Mourning a living parent is a unique type of agony. When a parent passes away, you mourn the loss of the person who loved you. When a toxic parent discards you, you mourn the realization that the protector you desperately wanted never actually existed. I sat on the faded linoleum floor of my kitchen, pulled my knees to my chest, and wept. I cried for the little girl who used to try so hard to earn her father's approval. I cried for the young woman who still, against all logic, wanted her mother to shield her from the cold. The pain felt infinite, a dark ocean threatening to pull me under. The sound of a key turning in the front door lock jolted me. Ethan walked in, shaking snow from his dark hair. He dropped his keys in the ceramic bowl by the entrance, his eyes immediately finding me on the floor. He did not ask what was wrong. He crossed the small room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside me. He saw the glossy holiday card on the counter and the glowing phone in my hand. He gently pried the device from my fingers and read the screen. His jaw tensed, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. Ethan did not offer hollow platitudes. He did not tell me to forgive them or to turn the other cheek. He pulled me into his chest, wrapping his arms around my shaking shoulders. "Paige," he whispered, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the storm. "They are shrinking you to make themselves feel big. They have to paint you as a failure because your independence terrifies them. Your worth is not tied to their fragile vanity. You are brilliant. You are building an empire. Let them think whatever they want. Their delusion does not dictate your reality." I pressed my face into his shoulder, breathing in the scent of crisp winter air and old paper that always clung to his suits. His words pierced the fog of my grief. He was right. My mother wanted me to read that comment and feel shame. She wanted me to feel small. But shame requires consent, and I suddenly refused to give it. The tears stopped falling. A calm, clinical clarity washed over my mind, replacing the sorrow with an unbreakable resolve. I pulled back from Ethan's embrace, wiping the dampness from my cheeks. I picked up my phone. I navigated to my sister's profile and tapped the small icon in the top right corner. Block user. I moved to my mother's page. Block user. I searched for my father, my brother-in-law, and every extended relative who participated in their toxic ecosystem. I blocked them all. I erased their digital footprint from my life with a few decisive taps, severing the final invisible strings they used to manipulate my emotions. A profound sense of liberation settled into my chest as the screen went blank. My family believed their public erasure was a punishment. They thought rendering me invisible would starve me of the attention I supposedly craved. They fundamentally misunderstood my strategy. Invisibility was not a curse. It was the perfect camouflage. If my father believed I was drowning in poverty, he would never look toward the tech sector. He would never realize that Vanguard Data was finalizing an algorithm that was about to revolutionize regional healthcare. Let them have their curated photos and their country club gossip. I was going to conquer the Silicon Slopes in total silence. The winter passed, giving way to a bright, productive spring. Our camouflage worked flawlessly, allowing me to pour every waking hour into scaling the business without a single distraction. Vanguard Data was finally outgrowing our cramped living room. I secured enough early-stage funding to move out of the digital realm and into a physical space. I found the perfect, modest office suite in Lehigh, ready to sign the commercial lease that would officially launch my company into the public sphere. But I underestimated the vast, creeping shadow of my father's real estate empire. Just as I prepared to put my pen to the contract, I discovered that hiding from a predator is very different from escaping one. Spring brought a surge of momentum that made the suffocating winter feel like a distant memory. Vanguard data outgrew the boundaries of our small living room. The predictive healthcare algorithms required dedicated servers, and I needed a professional environment to host upcoming client demonstrations. Lehi offered the perfect terrain. Often referred to as the heart of the Silicon Slopes, it was a booming tech corridor filled with hungry innovators and sleek architecture. I found a modest suite on the third floor of a glass building overlooking the interstate. The space smelled of fresh drywall, industrial carpet, and pure potential. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the exact spot where I planned to put my desk. I held a heavy brass pen, signed the commercial lease, and felt a profound sense of pride. I paid the deposit and ordered 3 ergonomic chairs. For the first time, my vision had physical walls. 72 hours before the scheduled move-in date, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the property management firm. I answered with a smile, expecting to discuss keycard access or parking assignments. Instead, the property manager, a young man who had been overly enthusiastic during our tour, sounded out of breath. His voice shook. He stammered through a disjointed apology, citing a sudden zoning irregularity and an unforeseen conflict of interest. Before I could request clarification, he informed me that the lease was terminated. He wired the deposit back to my account while we were still on the line. The call disconnected with a sharp click. I sat in the silence of my apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Instinct told me this was no administrative error. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Utah Corporate Registry. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the ownership structure of the property management firm. It took 20 minutes of untangling shell entities and holding companies to find the truth. At the very top of the corporate hierarchy sat a familiar entity, Sanders Commercial Properties. My father's business held their most lucrative maintenance and development contracts. Warren had seen my name cross a regional lease application. He leveraged his vast influence, threatening to pull his accounts unless the firm locked me out. The revelation hit my chest like a physical shove. Suddenly, I was not standing in my kitchen. I was transported back to that freezing limestone driveway, the winter wind slicing through my thin cardigan, hearing the heavy deadbolt slide into place. My father had not stopped punishing me. He merely changed his weapon, from a locked door to corporate sabotage. A soft chime broke my trance. My phone screen lit up on the counter. A text message appeared from an unknown number. The message contained a single sentence. Business is brutal when you do not have a family to protect you. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to realize I could never outrun his reach in this tight-knit state. He expected me to fold, to surrender my ambitions and return to his kingdom in defeat. Ethan walked in an hour later and read the glowing screen. His eyes darkened. His prosecutor instincts flared to life. "We should fight him in court," Ethan suggested, his voice low and steady. "This is textbook tortious interference. We can subpoena the property manager and expose the threat." I shook my head. Taking Warren to court meant stepping into his arena. A lawsuit would put a giant neon target on my back, draining my limited capital and wasting years of my life. I needed a shield, not a sword. If the Sanders name was the liability attracting his fire, I decided to erase my name from the board entirely. The next morning, I executed a flawless corporate pivot. I contacted a specialized attorney outside the state and restructured the entire foundation of my enterprise. We registered a new parent entity in Delaware, naming it Horizon Analytics. The title was intentionally dull, designed to vanish into the endless sea of tech startups. Vanguard Data became a hidden subsidiary nested deep within its structure. I removed myself from every public registry, state database, and corporate charter. I assumed the title of silent founder and lead architect. To handle client negotiations and serve as the public face of the company, I hired a seasoned tech executive named Marcus. He possessed gray hair, a steady handshake, and zero ties to the Salt Lake City elite. He became the brilliant frontman. I became the ghost in the machine. Losing the commercial lease meant we had no physical headquarters. I turned that deficit into my greatest strategic advantage. I transitioned our operations to a fully decentralized remote workforce. Without geographic boundaries tying me to the Utah Valley, I recruited brilliant data engineers from Austin, Seattle, and Toronto. Eliminating commercial rent, utilities, and office insurance slashed my operational overhead by 40%. The math was beautiful. That pivotal shift freed up an enormous pool of capital. I redirected those funds away from office furniture and poured them directly into accelerated algorithmic development and top-tier cybersecurity infrastructure. 6 months later, our enhanced security protocols qualified my company to bid on federal contracts. We submitted a comprehensive proposal to the Department of Defense, aiming to streamline their veterans' healthcare triage system using our predictive data models. The federal government did not care about Utah Country Club politics. They did not care who my father was. They only cared about the undeniable efficiency of the algorithm. We won the bid. It was a multi-million-dollar contract. The valuation of my quiet startup skyrocketed into the realm of 9 figures overnight. We were highly profitable, rapidly expanding, and entirely untraceable to Paige Sanders. My father tried to starve my business by locking me out of a tiny office suite. Instead, his sabotage forced me to build an impenetrable fortress. His cruelty became the exact catalyst for my explosive, secretive wealth. I was generating revenue that rivaled his entire commercial portfolio, yet I still drove a used sedan and bought my groceries on sale. My camouflage held strong. We were untouchable in the digital sphere. But the physical world still presented unique risks. I believed the Sanders family could not reach me as long as I stayed hidden behind my corporate shield. I failed to anticipate the boundless reach of my sister's vanity. While my father utilized his power to destroy, Audrey preferred a different tactic. She preferred to steal. The glittering chandeliers of the Grand America Hotel Ballroom cast a brilliant light over the wealthiest residents of Salt Lake City. The annual Women in Technology Philanthropy Guild Gala was the premier event of the autumn social season. It was a gathering designed for high society wives and ambitious social climbers to exchange polite compliments while wearing designer gowns that cost more than most cars. The room smelled of roasted tenderloin, expensive orchids, and intense ambition. I stood near the back of the cavernous hall, hidden in the dim lighting near a towering ice sculpture. I wore a simple black silk dress with no recognizable labels. My presence went entirely unnoticed by the elite crowd. I purchased my ticket under a corporate alias, attending simply to observe the charitable landscape of the city. My sister Audrey thrived in environments like this. She practically fed on the validation of wealthy peers. I spotted her near the front row, wearing a sparkling emerald gown that caught every flash of the event photographer's cameras. Audrey had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to secure a seat on the board of directors for this specific philanthropic guild. Membership granted unparalleled access to the wives of prominent senators and venture capitalists. However, gaining a seat required more than just a large checkbook. Board members were expected to present innovative, groundbreaking initiatives to prove their intellectual worth. Audrey was not an innovator. She was an imitator, who excelled at packaging other people's ideas as her own. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the grand podium, tapping the microphone. A hush fell over the clinking silver forks and crystal wine glasses. She announced the keynote speaker of the evening, praising this individual for her visionary approach to community health. The crowd offered polite, rhythmic applause. Audrey stood up, smoothed the skirt of her emerald gown, and glided toward the stage. She smiled with that practiced, flawless radiance she inherited from our mother. She adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of influential faces. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. The cold condensation from the glass dampened my fingers. I expected Audrey to deliver a generic speech about charity drives or fundraising galas. I expected empty, polished rhetoric. Instead, Audrey cleared her throat and began to outline a new project she called the Utah Health Predictive Network. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped moving. Audrey spoke with vibrant enthusiasm. She detailed a software initiative designed to predict hospital readmission rates by utilizing machine learning algorithms. She explained how this system would streamline triage protocols and allocate emergency resources before critical shortages occurred. She was not just sharing a similar concept. She was reading the exact proprietary mission statement from my company. I gripped my water glass so tightly my knuckles turned stark white against my skin. Audrey moved into the technical specifications of her presentation. She used phrases like dynamic demographic routing and heuristic resource allocation. Those were my words. I typed those exact sentences at a chipped laminate kitchen table at 3 a.m. while surviving on stale bagels and black tea. I engineered that data model while she was sipping champagne at luxury ski resorts. My mind raced, calculating how she obtained the information. Vanguard data was shielded behind layers of corporate anonymity, but we had recently submitted a highly detailed proposal to the state health department for a regional contract. Spencer sat on the legislative committee that reviewed those state proposals. He must have brought a printed executive summary home. Audrey likely found the document on his desk, realized it sounded brilliant, and decided to lift the entire concept to secure her coveted board seat. She assumed the anonymous tech firm from Delaware would never cross paths with a local society gala. She assumed she was safe. The audacity of her theft sent a hot wave of adrenaline flooding into my bloodstream. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to walk directly down the center aisle, climb the carpeted steps to the stage, and expose her fraud to the entire room. I wanted to rip the microphone from her manicured hands. I wanted to watch her flawless facade crumble under the weight of the truth. But a familiar voice echoed in the back of my mind. It was Ethan. My husband spent his days in federal courtrooms, dismantling corporate criminals piece by piece. He operated with lethal patience. He always told me that anger is a useful fuel, but it is a terrible compass. He taught me that when your opponent is digging their own grave, you do not take away their shovel. You wait until they are too deep to climb out. Never interrupt an enemy who is making a documented mistake. The ringing in my ears subsided, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. I let go of my water glass. I reached into my small evening bag and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the camera application, switched to the high-definition video setting, and pressed record. I zoomed in slightly, capturing the bright stage lighting illuminating my sister's face. The audio picked up every stolen syllable bouncing off the ballroom walls. I recorded Audrey claiming my sleepless nights as her own intellectual triumphs. I documented her accepting the awe and admiration of the wealthiest women in the state, based entirely on my intellectual property. The video captured her radiant, victorious smile as she concluded her speech. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. Women stood up clapping enthusiastically for the brilliant mind of Audrey Sanders. I lowered my phone, hit save, and slipped the device back into my purse. A genuine, quiet smile spread across my face. My sister thought she had executed the perfect crime. She believed she had cemented her legacy in the upper echelons of Utah society. But she was missing a critical piece of information. It was a secret that made the entire evening profoundly ironic. This specific charity gala was not just a social gathering. It was a fundraising event organized to secure capital for local health initiatives. The foundation hosting the dinner relied heavily on a single, massive contribution to keep their doors open. The Master of Ceremonies returned to the podium to thank the anonymous primary benefactor who had recently written a 7-figure check to underwrite the entire evening's program. The crowd clapped again, praising the generosity of the invisible donor. That anonymous benefactor was Horizon Analytics, my parent company. Vanguard Data was the primary financial engine keeping this philanthropic guild afloat. Audrey had just stood on a stage and pitched my own stolen intellectual property directly to my own charitable foundation. She was desperately trying to impress the invisible donor by stealing the invisible donor's life work. The trap was now perfectly loaded. I possessed the time-stamped video. I possessed the original source code and the filed patents. I held every single card in the deck. I turned away from the stage, leaving the ballroom while Audrey was still shaking hands and accepting lavish praise. I walked out into the cool autumn night air, feeling an incredible sense of power. I did not need to scream or fight in the mud. I just needed to let the clock run out. But a simple intellectual property theft was not enough to dismantle the deep roots of my family. Audrey was only a symptom of the disease. My father and Spencer were the true architects of my isolation. To truly break their grip, Ethan and I needed to elevate our status far beyond the reach of local politics and commercial real estate. We needed to operate on a level where their wealth and influence meant nothing. The silence of our ascent was about to require a discipline that tested the very limits of our endurance. The 3 years following the charity gala were defined by shadows and sweat. We did not merely survive my family's rejection. We weaponized it. Vanguard Data mutated from a struggling startup into an industry titan. My transition to a decentralized workforce proved to be a stroke of operational genius. Unburdened by expensive commercial leases, I recruited top-tier data scientists from across the globe. We finalized our algorithms encrypting the proprietary code behind layers of corporate security. When we secured the Department of Defense contract to overhaul their veterans' healthcare triage system, the trajectory of my life altered permanently. The influx of federal capital pushed my parent company valuation into 9-figure territory. I sat in my home office one Tuesday afternoon, staring at a screen displaying a net worth exceeding $200 million. I traced the numbers with my fingertip, trying to reconcile those vast digits with the girl who was thrown out into the freezing snow with nothing but a thin coat. Ethan climbed a parallel mountain, matching my ascent step for step. The grueling hours he spent in the public defender's office had honed his courtroom instincts into a lethal precision. He transitioned to the United States Attorney's Office, quickly securing a position as an elite federal prosecutor. He specialized in dismantling complex corporate fraud rings and prosecuting white-collar criminals who mistakenly thought their offshore accounts made them untouchable. Ethan possessed a terrifying, quiet competence. He never yelled in the courtroom. He never relied on theatrics. He simply laid out the paper trail, weaving intricate webs of undeniable evidence, and let arrogant executives suffocate under the weight of their own greed. His conviction rate caught the attention of powerful political figures, earning him a reputation as an incorruptible force within the justice system. Together, we built an impenetrable fortress. We purchased 30 acres of rugged, untamed land deep in the Wasatch Back, miles away from the country club gossip of Park City. We commissioned a secluded, modernist home built of raw concrete, dark steel, and expansive glass. It sat nestled among towering Douglas firs, invisible from the main highway. Inside, the floors were heated, polished stone. The kitchen featured professional-grade appliances imported from Germany. It was a sanctuary of unbothered luxury, a physical manifestation of our independence. Yet, whenever we ventured down into the Salt Lake Valley, we maintained our deliberate camouflage. We kept our 10-year-old sedans. I wore tailored cashmere that looked like generic wool to the untrained eye. Ethan bought modest, off-the-rack suits for his daily commutes. We left zero public footprint. We avoided social media. We dodged society page features. We operated as ghosts among the elite. But let me tell you the hardest part about succeeding in a vacuum. It is not the relentless hours or the heavy workload. It is the crushing, suffocating discipline required to stay quiet. Every Thanksgiving that passed, every curated family photo I intercepted through mutual acquaintances, my chest ached with a toxic cocktail of grief and pride. Human nature begs for vindication. When the people who are supposed to love you treat you like dirt, every fiber of your being wants to rent a billboard and staple your bank statements to it. I wanted to drive a custom imported sports car onto my father's pristine driveway, drop a multi-million-dollar check on his mahogany desk, and watch his jaw hit the floor. The urge to prove them wrong burned in the back of my throat like swallowed embers. I have to ask you a question. Have you ever possessed the ultimate trump card in an argument? The single piece of evidence that would obliterate your opponent, and chosen to hold it back? If you know the sheer agonizing willpower it takes to bite your tongue when you are holding a royal flush, tell me in the comments. How do you stop yourself from dropping the bomb? Because I spent years swallowing my pride. I realized that arguing with my family meant seeking their validation. I did not want their validation anymore. I wanted their irrelevance. The discipline required to maintain that silence forged an unspoken, unbreakable bond between Ethan and me. We understood the long game. One Sunday morning, bright winter sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our mountain home, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I walked into the living room, holding 2 mugs of dark roast coffee. Ethan sat in his leather armchair, a thick, leather-bound legal textbook resting on his knees. He was highlighting passages with intense focus, his brow furrowed in concentration. I leaned over his shoulder, reading the dense typography. It was a comprehensive treatise on federal commercial land use law, specifically focusing on environmental protection statutes and illegal municipal zoning circumvention. I handed him the warm ceramic mug. "Are you prosecuting a commercial real estate developer?" I asked, tracing the line of his jaw with my free hand. He closed the heavy book, accepting the coffee. His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Not exactly," he replied, taking a slow sip. "I am just brushing up on the statutes. Consider it a hobby." I laughed, shaking my head. A federal prosecutor reading municipal zoning law for fun. You need a better weekend outlet. He smiled, a cool, calculated expression that sent a sudden shiver of anticipation down my spine. "You never know when a specific jurisdiction might become relevant," he murmured, turning his attention back to the dense pages. I dismissed it as a quirk of a brilliant, restless mind. I had no idea he was systematically mapping the exact legal coordinates of my father's vulnerabilities. Warren built his empire on ruthless land acquisition and questionable municipal zoning permits. Ethan was quietly studying the structural integrity of the Sanders family legacy, searching for the exact stress point that would bring the entire building down. He was preparing for a war I did not even realize we were fighting. The seasons shifted, painting the mountain peaks in vibrant autumn gold before settling into a deep, freezing winter. Our 5th year of marriage arrived. Vanguard Data finalized the Department of Defense integration, pushing our quarterly revenue into uncharted territory. We were sitting by the dark steel fireplace one evening in late January, the only sound the soft crackle of burning cedar logs. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, rattling the high glass panes. Ethan's encrypted government-issued mobile phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. It was past 10 o'clock at night. A call at this hour rarely meant good news. The caller ID displayed a blocked number originating from Washington District of Columbia. Ethan muted the television. The ambient noise vanished from the room. He picked up the device, his expression shifting from relaxed domesticity to sharp professional vigilance. "Caldwell," he answered. I watched his posture stiffen. He stood up, pacing toward the expansive glass windows overlooking the dark, snow-covered valley. He spoke in low, measured tones. "Yes, Senator. I understand the gravity of the nomination. I am honored by the recommendation. The President has my full commitment." My breath hitched. The words echoed in the cavernous room. Senator, nomination, the President. I set my book aside, my pulse accelerating into a frantic, hammering rhythm. Ethan paced the length of the room for another 10 minutes, discussing Judicial Committee's background checks and expedited Senate confirmation hearings. He nodded sharply, offering sincere, respectful affirmations. When he finally disconnected the call, he set the phone down and turned to face me. The glow of the fire illuminated the sharp, focused angles of his face. He walked over, took both of my hands, and pulled me to my feet. He did not shout or celebrate wildly. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying gravity of a man who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom. "The Judicial Committee is expediting the process," Ethan said softly, his thumbs tracing the knuckles of my hands. "We are flying to the Capitol next week. If the confirmation holds, I will be taking the bench in the spring." He was not just securing a promotion. He was stepping into a lifetime appointment. Ethan Caldwell, the man my father discarded as a penniless nobody, was about to become a United States federal judge. He would soon wield unparalleled, unassailable jurisdiction over the very district my family thought they ruled. The chess pieces were finally locking into place. Our silent years of grinding isolation were over. The storm was gathering over the Wasatch Mountains, and my parents were about to invite the thunder directly into their own home. The timeline of our silent exile finally merged with the present day. Spring arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, melting the frost from the lower elevations, though thick white snow still blanketed the high peaks of Park City. Our lives operated on a dual frequency. Vanguard Data secured its second major federal contract, elevating our corporate revenue to heights that rivaled the largest tech firms in the state. Meanwhile, Ethan's confirmation hearings concluded in Washington. The Senate voted. The outcome was a resounding success. We were standing on the precipice of a monumental shift, waiting for the final swearing-in ceremony to cement his lifetime appointment to the federal bench. It was during this week of quiet triumph that my past reached out to tap me on the shoulder. I drove to our private postal box in a sleepy town 20 miles outside the city. We utilized this anonymous address to intercept residual corporate mail and preserve the secrecy of our mountain residence. I unlocked the small metal door and pulled out a stack of generic business envelopes. Hidden in the center of the pile was a thick, oversized square envelope made of heavy cotton blend paper. The edges were lined in metallic gold foil. I recognized the scent before I even saw the return address. It smelled like expensive gardenia perfume and old money vanity. My thumb slid beneath the flap, breaking a pressed wax seal, bearing a fabricated family crest my father designed a decade ago to make his real estate empire appear aristocratic. I withdrew the cardstock. The sweeping calligraphy announced the 35th wedding anniversary of Warren and Lorraine Sanders. They were hosting a lavish family reunion and celebratory dinner at a rented luxury ski lodge in Park City. The guest list included over 100 of the most influential political figures, venture capitalists, and property developers in the region. I read the formal printed text, feeling a strange sense of detachment. The Sanders marriage was not a romance worth celebrating. It was a prolonged business merger, held together by mutual ambition and a shared obsession with societal status. Yet they were gathering the elite of Utah to witness their enduring, flawless facade. Then my eyes drifted to the very bottom of the invitation. Written in the distinct, sharp cursive of my mother was a personalized addendum. The ink pressed deeply into the paper, revealing the force she used to write it. "We are keeping this intimate," the note read. "No +1s permitted unless legally married." I stood in the sterile lobby of the post office, holding the heavy cardstock under the fluorescent lights. The sheer audacity of that single sentence stopped the breath in my lungs. It was not a logistical request. It was a targeted, calculated insult. My mother assumed I was either living in sin with a man who refused to commit, or that Ethan had abandoned me entirely to the poverty my father predicted. By dictating a strict marriage rule, she intended to force me to arrive alone, stripping away whatever meager emotional support she assumed I possessed. Beyond the insult, a deeper strategic motive lingered beneath the surface of the invitation. Why break 5 years of radio silence to invite the scapegoat daughter to a highly publicized society event? The answer required very little analysis. Spencer was preparing to officially announce his exploratory committee for the governor's office. At the same time, my father was quietly battling a federal land use lawsuit regarding his illegal commercial developments on protected territory. They needed a unified, pristine family image to project stability to their donors and investors. An estranged, exiled daughter roaming the valley raised uncomfortable questions. But a broken, destitute daughter returning to the fold to beg for forgiveness proved the benevolent Christian mercy of the Sanders family. They did not want to reconcile with me. They needed me as a prop. They needed a cautionary tale to parade in front of their guests. A sudden sound broke the quiet of the post office. It was a laugh. It bubbled up from my chest, echoing off the rows of metal mailboxes. I laughed at the rich, absurd irony of their delusion. I looked down at my left hand. Resting on my ring finger was an emerald-cut diamond, internally flawless, set in a simple platinum band. It did not feature gaudy halos or excessive side stones. It was an understated testament to a net worth that eclipsed my father's entire commercial portfolio. Ethan purchased it after Vanguard hit its first major valuation milestone. I wore it every day, a quiet symbol of a partnership built in the trenches, forged without a single cent of conditional family money. My mother assumed I could not afford a wedding license. She had no idea she was attempting to humiliate the wealthiest woman on her guest list. I left the post office and drove back up the canyon to our secluded concrete and steel home. I walked through the heavy front door, the heated stone floors warming my boots. I found Ethan in the primary suite. He stood beside the bed, carefully folding a crisp white dress shirt and placing it into a sleek leather garment bag. His dark charcoal suit lay perfectly pressed across the mattress. His flight to Washington departed in 48 hours. The president was scheduled to officially sign his commission. He was packing for the final transition from a brilliant prosecutor to a United States district judge. I walked up behind him and rested my chin on his shoulder. He turned his head, kissing my temple. I handed him the cream-colored invitation. He scanned the calligraphy, his eyes moving quickly down to the handwritten note at the bottom. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He traced his thumb over my mother's sharp cursive. "They want you to walk into a firing squad without any backup," he said, his voice a low, protective rumble. "We can decline this. You do not owe them an appearance." I shook my head, stepping around to face him. "I want to go." Ethan searched my eyes. He understood the psychological toll my family extracted. He knew the grueling discipline it took to remain silent for half a decade. "Are you sure you want to subject yourself to that room?" he asked gently. "I have never been more ready," I replied. "They think they hold all the leverage. They think this party is their crowning achievement. I want to look them in the eye while they believe they have won. It is the final test of my discipline. If I can sit through this dinner without reacting, I know they can never touch me again." A slow, terrifyingly confident smile spread across Ethan's face. He understood the tactical advantage of letting the enemy exhaust their ammunition against a fortified target. He checked the itinerary on his phone. My flight lands at Salt Lake City International at 6 o'clock on the evening of the dinner. The reception begins at 7. I will have a federal transport vehicle waiting on the tarmac. I can be up the mountain and at the lodge just as they start serving the main course. I reached out, adjusting the lapel of his packed suit jacket. "I will hold the front line until you arrive," I promised. That evening, I walked into my home office and retrieved my favorite fountain pen. I filled out the small, textured RSVP card included with the invitation. I checked the box, confirming my attendance with a firm, decisive stroke of black ink. On the line requesting the total number of guests in my party, I wrote a single, elegant digit. 1. I sealed the envelope, affixed a generic stamp, and placed it in the outgoing mail. I gave my family exactly what they wanted. I confirmed their bias. I played the role of the isolated, discarded daughter returning to the kingdom in defeat. The days leading up to the reunion passed in a blur of corporate strategy and quiet anticipation. I drove Ethan to the private aviation terminal, kissing him goodbye as he boarded the jet to the capital. I returned to our mountain sanctuary alone, spending the final hours selecting my armor for the evening. I bypassed the racks of bright colors and obvious designer labels. I chose a custom-tailored gray cashmere outfit. It was a masterpiece of stealth wealth, lacking any recognizable logos or flashy hardware. To the untrained, label-obsessed eyes of Park City society, it would look like a generic, uninspired sweater set. I paired it with my unbranded leather bag and concealed my diamond watch beneath the soft fabric of my sleeve. When the sun dipped below the Wasatch Peaks on the evening of the anniversary, casting long purple shadows across the snow, I stepped into my armored SUV. I turned the ignition, the engine purring with quiet, engineered power. I steered the vehicle down our hidden driveway and merged onto the highway, winding toward the luxury ski lodge. The timeline had officially caught up to the present. The silent years of grinding isolation were over. I was driving straight into the lion's den, armed with a hidden empire, and the absolute certainty that the man they called a nobody was currently racing up the mountain to execute a flawless, judicial checkmate. The stage was set. The audience was waiting. All I had to do was find my seat. The winding mountain highway ascending into Park City was slick with fresh ice and packed snow. Tall silhouettes of ancient pine trees lined the dark road, their branches heavy with winter frost. I drove in silence, feeling the smooth, engineered hum of my custom utility vehicle. To any casual observer looking out through the frosted lodge windows, I was steering a generic, uninspiring dark SUV. It looked like the kind of vehicle a struggling administrative assistant might purchase used. They could not see the reinforced steel paneling hidden within the doors. They could not detect the bulletproof glass windows or the advanced security systems hardwired into the dashboard. My transportation was designed for survival and anonymity. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the grand estate. The lodge loomed against the night sky, a towering structure constructed of raw timber and expansive glass panes, radiating warm golden light. A line of luxury vehicles already crowded the entrance. The valet attendant, a young man bundled in a thick winter coat, rushed past my driver's side door. He ignored my arrival to fawn over a cherry-red Ferrari pulling up directly behind me, eager to impress the driver wearing a flashy designer suit. The attendant eventually circled back to my humble SUV. He grabbed my keys without making eye contact, offered no greeting, and handed me a crumpled paper stub. The strict social hierarchy of Park City was firmly established before I even stepped foot inside the building. Surface appearances dictated your worth in this altitude. The heavy oak doors swung open, welcoming me into a cavernous lobby that felt more like a fortress than a hotel. The air carried the rich, complex aroma of roasted pine, expensive catering, and burning cedar logs from a colossal stone fireplace. A string quartet played softly in a far corner, their classical music floating above the low, steady hum of wealthy patrons exchanging political favors and business strategies. I checked my winter coat at the front desk, revealing my tailored gray cashmere outfit. The fabric was spun from the rarest natural fibers, stitched by hand in a private European atelier. It draped perfectly, whispering a language of unbothered luxury that required no introduction. My family, however, only understood fashion if it shouted. They relied on recognizable logos to communicate their bank balances. To their untrained eyes, I was wearing a generic sweater set pulled from a discount rack. I walked into the main banquet hall. It was a breathtaking space decorated with hanging crystal chandeliers and draped in heavy white silks. My mother stood near the grand entrance, greeting guests with that practiced, radiant smile she reserved exclusively for high society. She wore a deep burgundy gown that swept across the polished hardwood floor. When her eyes finally landed on me, the manufactured warmth vanished from her expression. Her posture stiffened. She quickly rearranged her features into a mask of tragic maternal pity and drifted across the room toward me, her heels clicking a sharp, deliberate rhythm. Paige Lorraine sighed, extending her hands to gently grasp my upper arms. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering critically on my unbranded sweater and simple leather shoes. "You actually came. I was so worried you would stay hidden away down in the valley." "I RSVP'd," I replied, keeping my voice even and entirely pleasant. "It is a milestone anniversary. I would not miss such an important evening." Lorraine tilted her head, adopting a hushed, confidential tone meant to simulate genuine care. "We saw your little car pull up in the driveway. Did the staff charge you for valet parking? I know the rates up here at the resort are very steep. I can have your father validate your ticket, or I can just give you some cash from my purse. We do not want this evening to be a financial burden on you." She was offering me $20 in front of passing state senators. It was a highly calculated attempt to assert her dominance and highlight my presumed poverty. She wanted me to feel small, hoping I would accept her charity and validate her narrative of my helpless existence. "That is very kind, Mother," I said, offering a serene, unbreakable smile. "But I have it handled." Before Lorraine could push the issue further and manufacture a scene, Audrey materialized beside us. My older sister looked like a walking billboard for European luxury houses. She wore a flashy designer dress, covered in recognizable gold monograms, carrying a handbag that featured a giant, ostentatious brass logo on the clasp. Her entire aesthetic screamed for attention and external validation. She looped her arm through our mother's elbow and looked at me with undisguised amusement. "Well," Audrey purred, her eyes scanning the empty space beside me. "I see you arrived solo. We all figured the strict guest rule might be an issue for you. It is such a shame you are facing this big night all alone. She was digging for a reaction, probing my defenses, hoping to see the sting of rejection register on my face. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my isolation. She did not know that the man she mocked was currently touching down on a private tarmac just miles away, carrying a federal commission bearing the signature of the President of the United States. I am quite comfortable on my own, Audrey, I said, keeping my tone light. Your dress is certainly vibrant. You always did enjoy standing in the spotlight. Audrey puffed her chest out slightly, missing the subtle underlying critique. Spencer and I have a lot to celebrate tonight. He is making a major announcement during dinner. The whole state will be talking about his speech tomorrow. I thought about the hidden digital dashboard waiting on my phone screen, tracking the corporate intellectual property lawsuit aimed directly at her stolen charity initiative. The whole state would indeed be talking about her tomorrow, just not in the heroic context she anticipated. I look forward to hearing all about it, I said smoothly. A hostess holding an embossed leather seating chart approached our tense circle. She offered a polite, deferential bow to my mother and sister, informing them that the first course was being prepared. Lorraine and Audrey turned toward the front of the room. The grand head table was a magnificent structure positioned on a raised dais overlooking the snow-capped mountain peaks through expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. Imported white orchids cascaded down the center of the pristine linen tablecloth. That table was strictly reserved for the power brokers. Warren, Lorraine, Audrey Spencer, and a handful of key political donors were assigned to those velvet-upholstered chairs. "Right this way, miss," the hostess said, turning to me. Her tone shifted instantly from reverent to brisk and efficient. She led me away from the elevated platform. We walked past the secondary tables reserved for minor politicians and wealthy country club friends. We kept walking. We passed the tables assigned to distant cousins and business associates. The floral centerpieces grew smaller and less intricate the further back we traveled. The journey felt deliberate, a physical manifestation of my social exile. Finally, we arrived at the very rear of the banquet hall. The hostess stopped at a tiny circular table positioned directly adjacent to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. The lighting here was dim and unflattering. The draft from the service hallway carried the sharp scent of dish soap and discarded food. My dining companions were already seated. One was a bored event photographer, busily swapping out camera lenses, ignoring the room entirely. The other was a distant relative, staring blankly at her phone screen, offering no greeting. This was my designated place in the family ranking. They placed me in the darkest, least desirable corner of the room, assuming the sheer indignity of the seating arrangement would break my resolve. They wanted me to sit in the shadows and watch them reign over the room, hoping I would swallow my pride and beg for an invitation back to the inner circle. I pulled out my own chair and sat down gracefully. The wood beneath my hands tilted. The table wobbled unevenly, causing the silverware to rattle against the porcelain plates. A waiter rushed past the heavy kitchen door, thudding against the wall, sending a rush of cold air over my shoulders. The timeline seamlessly folded into itself. I was exactly where the story began. I signaled a passing server and requested a glass of sparkling water with lemon. The room hummed with the electric energy of clinking glasses and low conversations. The tension in my chest tightened, winding up like a coiled spring preparing to release. I pulled back my cashmere sleeve and checked the time on my hidden diamond watch. I typed my 3-word message to Ethan, asking if he was official. His reply vibrated against my palm a few moments later. Sworn in, wheels up, see you in 2 hours. The dinner service officially commenced. The plates of roasted elk arrived at the tables. The wine flowed freely into crystal glasses. Up at the front of the room, my family basked in their perceived victory, entirely unaware that the foundation of their empire was built on a fragile fault line. The storm they tried to keep out had already breached the perimeter, and the first lightning strike was about to hit the microphone. The dinner service operated with military precision. Waiters in starched white shirts moved through the banquet hall, carrying silver trays heavy with roasted root vegetables and seared elk medallions. The scent of rosemary and rich wine reduction filled the heated air, masking the underlying tension of 100 political climbers gathered in one room. My assigned seat at the rear of the hall provided a perfect vantage point to observe the ecosystem. The swinging metal door of the catering kitchen thudded open and shut inches from my left shoulder, sending frequent blasts of cold, sterile air across my back. My dining companions remained deeply uninteresting. A young event photographer spent the first 20 minutes polishing his camera lenses with a microfiber cloth, while a distant relative named Bethany scrolled endlessly through her social media feeds, determined to ignore my presence. I sat quietly, allowing the ambient noise to wash over me. Up at the elevated head table, my family held court. My father gripped a glass of dark red wine, nodding along to a story told by a prominent state senator. Audrey laughed at a joke, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder, ensuring the ballroom lights caught the heavy gold earrings she wore. They looked victorious. They believed their kingdom was secure, fortified by wealth and social standing. Then the inevitable performance began. My mother stood up from her velvet-upholstered chair. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it lightly against the rim of her crystal champagne flute. The clear, sharp chime pierced the low hum of conversation, bringing the entire ballroom to a sudden halt. Diners lowered their forks. Waiters froze in their tracks, pressing their backs against the wooden-paneled walls to avoid disrupting the moment. Lorraine smoothed the front of her burgundy silk gown and stepped toward the microphone positioned at the center of the dais. She excelled in these specific scenarios. Throughout my childhood, Lorraine never merely spoke to a crowd. She delivered sermons. She possessed a terrifying ability to weaponize polite society conventions, using flawless etiquette to disguise deep cruelty. She smiled warmly at the sea of expectant faces, clasping her hands together near her collarbone. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight." Her voice echoed through the discreet speakers hidden in the ceiling beams. To celebrate 35 years of marriage is a profound blessing. Warren and I built the Sanders legacy on a foundation of hard work, unyielding faith, and a commitment to this beautiful state. We look around this room and see our dearest friends, our valued partners, and the brilliant future of Utah. The guests offered a round of polite, rhythmic applause. Lorraine bowed her head slightly, accepting the adoration. But the celebratory tone was merely the prelude. She needed a contrast to highlight her own righteousness. She needed a shadow to make her light appear brighter. She lifted her chin, and her gaze traveled past the state senators, past the wealthy developers, and locked directly onto my face in the dim, drafty corner. Her expression shifted into a mask of profound, tragic sorrow. The transition was seamless, worthy of a theatrical award. And Lord, she continued, her voice taking on a hushed, reverent quality. We ask for your endless grace to guide those who have strayed from our family path. We pray for Paige. The acoustics of the grand hall amplified my name, sending it bouncing off the timber-vaulted ceiling. 100 heads turned in a synchronized wave. State politicians, country club wives, and real estate moguls shifted in their seats, searching the shadows, until they spotted me sitting next to the kitchen entrance. The collective weight of their stares felt tangible. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the room, broken only by the distant clatter of a falling pan in the catering area. We pray she finds her way out of her difficult financial struggles and poor life choices, my mother recited, her tone dripping with rehearsed pity. We ask that she finds the humility to seek guidance. We will always leave a light on for the lost. Husbands leaned over to whisper into the ears of their wives. Women in tailored dresses exchanged knowing, sympathetic glances, silently congratulating themselves for not raising such a problematic daughter. My sister Audrey smirked behind her water goblet, thoroughly enjoying the public execution of my character. My mother had just invoked the divine to label me a destitute failure in front of every influential figure in the region. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, designed to strip away my dignity and force a public surrender. 5 years ago, that targeted humiliation would have shattered me. I would have dropped my gaze to my lap, my cheeks burning with hot shame. I would have fled the ballroom, hiding in the freezing parking lot, while hot tears ruined my makeup, validating their belief that I was weak and broken. Tonight, I did not lower my eyes. I did not flush. I sat perfectly upright, my posture relaxed, breathing at a slow, measured pace. I reached down to the uneven leg of my circular table. My fingers brushed against the folded piece of paper I had wedged there earlier. It was the printed confirmation of the trust fund my father stole, the financial receipt that proved their corruption. That simple piece of paper held my table steady, just as the reality of my hidden empire held my mind steady. I did not need to defend myself against their false narrative, because their narrative was a crumbling fiction. A gentle vibration pulsed against my palm. I turned over my mobile device, keeping it concealed beneath the edge of the tablecloth. The screen illuminated, displaying a new incoming message from my husband. Sworn in, wheels up. See you in 2 hours. The words carried the force of a hurricane. Ethan was no longer a nominee. He was no longer a candidate waiting for approval. He was an official, confirmed, sitting United States District Judge. At this exact second, he was boarding a private federal transport jet, soaring across the country, carrying the legal authority to dismantle the arrogant empire currently celebrating its own superiority. The sheer scale of the power flying toward Park City made the room around me feel incredibly small. I locked my phone and set it aside. I looked back up at the elevated dais. My mother was still staring at me, waiting for the inevitable emotional collapse. She expected tears. She wanted me to shrink into the shadows. Instead, I smiled. It was not a forced, defensive grimace. It was a genuine, radiant expression of pure amusement. I reached forward, picked up my crystal water glass, and raised it toward her in a slow, deliberate mock salute. I tipped the rim toward the ceiling, acknowledging her performance, before taking a calm, refreshing sip. The effect on Lorraine was instantaneous and visceral. Her flawless, tragic facade fractured. The confident set of her shoulders dropped. Her mouth opened slightly, a micro-expression of profound confusion flashing across her features before she managed to compose herself. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium, her knuckles turning white. Scapegoats are assigned a very specific role within a toxic family system. We are expected to carry the blame, absorb the abuse, and react with predictable pain. When you refuse to read your assigned lines, the entire production falls apart. By smiling, I broke the script. I signaled that her weapon had misfired. The public prayer was designed to crush a struggling, impoverished outcast. But when you know you hold the winning hand, the insults of your enemy no longer sting. They just sound like bad comedy. The audience sensed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The whispers died down. The pitying stares turned into puzzled glances. Why was the ruined daughter smiling? Why did the matriarch look suddenly panicked? The power dynamic of the room wobbled, tilting on an invisible axis. Lorraine cleared her throat, her voice losing its melodic, confident cadence. She rushed through the final lines of her speech, thanking the guests once more, and quickly stepped away from the microphone. She returned to her seat, reaching immediately for her wine glass, her eyes darting back toward my dark corner with evident unease. A scattered, awkward round of applause rippled through the banquet hall. The string quartet in the corner hastily resumed playing a classical sonata, attempting to smooth over the jagged edges of the interaction. Waiters resumed their frantic pace, delivering the next course to the tables. I set my water glass down on the sturdy, stabilized surface and picked up my silver fork, enjoying the tender cut of meat on my plate. The psychological victory tasted sweeter than any vintage wine they served that night. But the evening was far from over. My mother had fired her best shot and missed. Now it was time for the men to take the stage. Spencer, seated 2 chairs down from my father, straightened his expensive silk tie and adjusted his suit jacket. He possessed an ego that required constant feeding, and he could not let a crowd of this magnitude go to waste. He pushed his chair back, preparing to reclaim the spotlight and make his grand move. He was about to share his political ambitions with the state, entirely unaware that the man who owned his future was currently descending through the clouds. The awkward, scattered applause following my mother's failed toast faded into a tense murmur. Lorraine sank back into her velvet-upholstered chair, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her wine glass. She avoided looking in my direction again. The atmosphere in the banquet hall felt brittle, like a pane of glass ready to shatter. The elite crowd needed a distraction to smooth over the social jagged edges she had just created. They needed a performance. My brother-in-law sensed the vacuum of attention and seized it with the predatory instinct of a career politician. Spencer pushed his chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floorboard, drawing every eye toward the elevated dais. He stood up, towering over the floral arrangements. He wore a pristine navy blue suit, tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that signaled conservative reliability. He unbuttoned his jacket with a practiced, fluid motion and strode toward the center microphone. He did not walk. He marched, projecting an aura of supreme, unearned confidence. At the head table, Audrey beamed. She practically vibrated with pride, her posture perfectly straight, ensuring the event photographers caught her best angle as she gazed adoringly at her husband. She believed she was married to the future of the state. Spencer gripped the edges of the wooden podium. He leaned close to the microphone, letting a charismatic, folksy smile spread across his face. He possessed an uncanny ability to read a room of wealthy donors and feed them exactly what they wanted to hear. What a beautiful tribute, Spencer began, his voice booming with rich, practiced resonance. Let us give another round of applause for Warren and Lorraine Sanders. 35 years of marriage is a profound achievement, but their true legacy is the unparalleled prosperity they have brought to our community. He clapped his hands together. The audience eagerly joined him, relieved to return to familiar congratulatory territory. The sycophants cheered. My father raised his glass in acknowledgement, his chest puffing out beneath his tuxedo jacket. But Spencer was not interested in celebrating his in-laws. He was merely using their anniversary as a launch pad. He let the applause die down, his expression shifting from joyful celebration to serious, focused determination. Looking around this room tonight, I do not just see friends and family. Spencer continued, his tone dropping an octave to convey artificial gravity. I see the engine of our great state. I see innovators. I see developers who take risks. I see the people who build the infrastructure that keeps our economy thriving. But lately, that engine has been stalling. We are facing unprecedented challenges from outside forces. The crowd leaned in. The clinking of silverware ceased entirely. The waiters froze against the walls. Spencer had their undivided attention, and he was steering the ship exactly where he wanted it to go. "We need leadership that understands the value of local enterprise," he declared, his voice rising in volume and intensity. "We need a governor who will stand up to bureaucratic overreach. That is why, tonight, surrounded by the people I respect most in this world, I am proud to officially announce the formation of my exploratory committee for the office of Governor of Utah." The banquet hall erupted. It was a deafening roar of approval. Men in expensive suits leaped to their feet, whistling and clapping. Women cheered, raising their crystal champagne flutes in the air. The flashbulbs of the hired photographers went off in a blinding, rapid-fire sequence, capturing Spencer's victorious, open-mouthed smile. Audrey stood up, waving to the crowd like royalty, her emerald gown glittering under the chandeliers. This was their crowning moment. They were declaring their ultimate ascension to the highest throne in local politics. I sat in my dim corner near the kitchen doors, watching the spectacle with a cold, analytical detachment. To the uninformed observer, Spencer looked like an unstoppable force. But I knew the structural integrity of his political platform. I knew it was built on quicksand. Spencer's entire campaign war chest relied on a single source of revenue: my father's commercial real estate empire. Warren was the invisible hand funding the polling data, the television advertisements, and the grassroots organizing. They were a symbiotic organism. Spencer provided the political protection, and Warren provided the capital. However, Warren was currently drowning in a legal nightmare that he desperately kept hidden from the society pages. For the past 3 years, my father had systematically bypassed environmental protection statutes to develop a sprawling, highly lucrative commercial resort near the borders of a protected national park. He forged municipal zoning permits, ignored ecological impact studies, and bulldozed federal wetlands. He believed his wealth made him immune to consequences, but the Department of Justice disagreed. Federal prosecutors had recently filed a staggering, sweeping land use lawsuit against his primary holding company. The injunction froze his construction assets. If Warren lost the upcoming federal hearings, the court would mandate astronomical fines and asset forfeitures. It would bankrupt his entire portfolio. If Warren fell, the money pipeline evaporated. Spencer's gubernatorial dreams would die before the ballots were even printed. Their shared survival depended entirely on beating the federal government in court. Spencer soaked in the applause for a full minute before raising his hands to quiet the ecstatic crowd. He was drunk on the validation. The adrenaline coursed through his veins, pushing him past the boundaries of scripted political rhetoric and into the dangerous territory of pure hubris. "When I look at the future of our economy," Spencer continued, his face flushed with excitement, "I see a landscape free of Washington interference. I see a state where developers like Warren Sanders can build our future without asking permission from out-of-touch bureaucrats sitting behind desks thousands of miles away." He turned his head toward the head table, looking directly at my father. Spencer offered a slow, deliberate, heavy wink. My father grinned, lifting his wine glass in a silent toast of solidarity. "My campaign will focus specifically on removing federal red tape," Spencer promised the crowd, pounding his fist against the podium for emphasis. "We are not going to let arbitrary environmental lawsuits stop our progress. We are going to fight back. And let me assure everyone in this room tonight, you do not need to worry about the hurdles currently in our way." He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, boastful register. "We have the right connections to ensure our upcoming federal court hearings go our way. We know the right people. We are going to take care of business." A chilling silence washed over my section of the room. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Spencer had just crossed a fatal line. In his desperate need to project power and reassure his nervous financial backers, he went off script. He essentially confessed to intending to manipulate or influence a federal judge. He bragged about rigging the judicial system on a hot microphone in a room filled with 100 people, including journalists and political rivals. It was a staggering display of arrogance. He believed he was invincible. He thought the law was merely a suggestion for people in his tax bracket. The dramatic irony was so thick it felt heavy in my lungs. Spencer was bragging about his imaginary connections to the federal judiciary, completely unaware that his fate was no longer in the hands of a local bribable magistrate. The case had been reassigned. The man who now held absolute, unassailable jurisdiction over my father's lawsuit and my brother-in-law's political future was not a friend of the Sanders family. I looked down at my left wrist. I pulled back the soft gray cashmere sleeve, revealing the face of my diamond-encrusted watch. The slender silver second hand swept in a smooth, continuous circle, ticking past the 12 o'clock mark. The timing was immaculate. As if orchestrated by a master conductor, the atmosphere in the grand banquet hall shifted. The ambient temperature seemed to plummet. The heavy, ornate oak doors at the very rear of the room, located just steps away from my wobbly overflow table, unlatched with a loud, distinct metallic click. The doors swung wide open, hitting the paneled walls with a resounding thud. A violent gust of crisp, freezing mountain air rushed into the stifling, perfume-heavy ballroom. The sudden draft caught the flames of the table candles, causing them to flicker and dance wildly. The string quartet stopped playing mid-measure. The collective attention of the room snapped away from Spencer's arrogant face at the podium and turned toward the back entrance. The storm they tried to lock out had finally breached the perimeter. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the banquet hall struck the paneled walls with a resounding thud. A freezing gust of mountain air rushed into the stifling room, extinguishing the flickering candles on the nearest tables. The sudden draft cut through the thick scent of expensive perfume and roasted catering. The lively chatter of 100 politicians and real estate developers died instantly. The string quartet in the far corner faltered their bows, freezing mid-measure. Every head in the room turned toward the disruption. A tall figure stepped across the threshold. Ethan did not look like the exhausted, overworked public defender my father banished half a decade ago. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit crafted from heavy European wool, tailored to trace the broad, strong lines of his shoulders. His posture radiated a terrifying, quiet authority. He moved with the effortless grace of an apex predator stepping into an enclosure full of domestic animals. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his expression was a mask of cool, clinical detachment. Flanking him on either side were two broad-chested men with severe haircuts. They wore identical dark suits and subtle, clear earpieces spiraling down their necks. They did not look at the lavish floral arrangements or the sparkling crystal chandeliers. Their eyes scanned the ballroom with tactical precision, evaluating every guest as a potential variable. They were United States Marshals, sworn federal agents assigned to protect the judiciary. Their presence alone signaled that the man walking between them possessed a rank that demanded highest-level government security. The visual disruption of federal law enforcement entering a local high society party was staggering. Spencer stood frozen at the wooden podium. His mouth hung slightly open. His grand political speech entirely derailed by this single arrival. He gripped the edges of the lectern, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the men walking down the center aisle. At the elevated head table, my mother narrowed her eyes, straining to identify the intruder. Lorraine had only met Ethan a handful of times when he was a young attorney wearing frayed off-the-rack collars and driving a 10-year-old sedan. The man currently striding through her elite anniversary party exuded a level of raw power that dwarfed her own husband. She did not recognize him. She could not reconcile the penniless ghost of her memory with the Titan commanding the attention of her rented ski lodge. She leaned forward in her velvet chair, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. Ethan did not glance at the head table. He ignored the prominent state senators and the wealthy donors whispering to one another. He navigated the narrow pathways between the tables, heading straight for the dimly lit corner by the catering kitchen. The wealthy guests leaned back in their chairs, parting like a physical wave to let him pass. He reached my tiny, unsteady overflow table. The hired event photographer sitting across from me stopped polishing his camera lenses, staring at the U.S. Marshals in wide-eyed silence. My distant relative lowered her phone, her jaw slack with shock. Ethan stopped beside my chair. The rigid, intimidating lines of his face softened the moment his eyes met mine. He leans down, placing one large hand on the back of my chair. He pressed a warm, lingering kiss to my forehead. The scent of crisp winter air and clean cedar radiated from his coat, grounding me in the reality of his presence. "Sorry I am late, darling," he said. His voice was a low, steady rumble that carried easily in the dead quiet of the room. The confirmation ran long. I looked up at him, feeling a profound surge of pride. "You are right on time," I replied softly. Up on the elevated dais, my father turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. His milestone anniversary gala was spinning rapidly out of his control. Warren Sanders despised being ignored. He tolerated no disruptions in his kingdom, especially from individuals who did not possess the proper social pedigree. He pushed himself up from his velvet chair with such force that it scraped loudly against the raised floorboards. He marched over to Spencer and snatched the microphone directly out of his hands. A sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the room, making several guests wince and cover their ears. Warren did not care. His entire focus was locked onto the back of Ethan's charcoal suit. "Excuse me?" Warren barked into the microphone. The sound echoed off the timber vaulted ceiling, amplifying his rage. His tone was laced with fierce hostility and the arrogant assumption of his own supremacy. "Who are you, and who let you in?" Ethan slowly straightened his posture. He turned his back to me and faced the head table. He took his time lifting his hands to casually adjust the center button of his suit jacket. It was a deliberate, unhurried motion, designed to demonstrate that he operated entirely on his own timeline. He did not need a microphone to command the room. Years of arguing complex federal cases had taught him how to project his voice from his diaphragm, filling cavernous spaces with clear, undeniable authority. "I am Paige's husband," Ethan stated. The words rang out across the banquet hall. I watched my sister Audrey drop her jaw. Her eyes darted frantically between my modest gray sweater and the impeccably dressed Titan standing in front of me. Lorraine let out a short, choked gasp. Her hand flew up to cover her mouth as the realization finally clicked into place. The discarded nobody, the man she just prayed over with fake pity, had returned. But Ethan was not finished. He held his chin high, his gaze locked directly onto my father's glaring eyes. "I am the Honorable Ethan Caldwell, United States District Judge for the District of Utah." The atmosphere in the banquet hall fractured. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd of corporate attorneys, real estate developers, and local politicians. These people understood the American legal hierarchy better than anyone else in the state. They spent their entire careers maneuvering through local courts, bribing municipal officials, and leveraging state connections to expand their wealth. But a sitting federal judge was an entirely different species. A federal judge held lifetime tenure. They could not be bought. They could not be intimidated. They held supreme jurisdiction over the very federal environmental laws my father was currently accused of violating. What happened next was a testament to the deeply ingrained reflexes of the legal and political profession. In any courtroom across the country, when a judge enters the chamber, every person is required to rise. It is a mandatory display of deference to the highest authority in the room. One by one, the corporate lawyers scattered throughout the guest list instinctively pushed their chairs back and stood up. It was a subconscious reaction wired into their muscle memory from years of legal practice. The state politicians, recognizing the shifting power dynamic and eager to show immediate respect to a prominent federal authority, quickly followed suit. The movement spread across the room like a cascading wave. Chairs scraped against the floor. Fine silk rustled as dozens of guests rose to their feet. Then the reflex hit the head table. Spencer, a man who just minutes ago bragged about his political invincibility, scrambled to his feet. His face was slick with sudden perspiration, his eyes wide with rising panic. Audrey stood up next to him, trembling as she gripped the edge of the pristine white tablecloth. And finally, driven by the sheer, overwhelming momentum of the room and the crushing weight of the title, my father stood up. Warren Sanders, the ruthless patriarch who banished me to the freezing snow. The billionaire who believed he owned the state of Utah was forced to rise from his seat. Ethan had not raised his voice. He had not issued a single threat. He brought the most powerful man in the room to his feet simply by existing. I sat in my chair near the swinging kitchen doors, watching my father stand in stunned, pale silence. The validation I felt was indescribable. This was the payoff for 5 years of eating cheap instant noodles, typing code until my fingers bled, and swallowing my pride while they erased my existence from holiday cards. We built an arsenal in the dark, and now we were stepping into the blinding light. The room belonged to us. However, the night was far from over. My father was standing out of respect for the title, but he did not yet grasp the full terrifying scope of his new reality. He was about to learn that the jurisdiction attached to that title was aimed directly at his own throat. The silence stretching across the banquet hall possessed a physical weight. It pressed down on the shoulders of the standing guests, trapping the room in a breathless tableau. Nobody dared to move. Nobody dared to speak. The only sound remaining was the low, steady hum of the heating vents trying to combat the freezing mountain draft pouring through the open rear entrance. I remained seated in my dim corner, watching the power structure of my entire life dismantle itself in real time. Up on the elevated dais, Spencer looked like a man who had just stepped onto a hidden landmine. A few moments prior, he was a charismatic political star basking in the glow of his own hubris. Now, the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen hue. Tiny beads of perspiration gathered along his hairline, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. He stood frozen behind the wooden podium, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of the lectern. The microphone, positioned inches from his mouth, suddenly transformed from a tool of influence into a lethal weapon. He had just broadcasted his intention to manipulate the federal judiciary to a room full of influential witnesses. He bragged about possessing the right connections to sway an upcoming court decision. He made those statements mere seconds before a sitting United States District Judge walked through the doors. The legal implications of his reckless boasting crashed over him. Spencer swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly above his silk tie. He attempted to salvage the catastrophe, leaning back toward the microphone. His voice, previously resonant and booming, now cracked with high-pitched panic. Judge Caldwell Spencer stammered the words, tumbling out in a frantic, disorganized rush. "We had no idea you were arriving. It is an honor. My earlier comments regarding the courts were merely rhetorical, a political metaphor, nothing more. We hold the utmost respect for the integrity of the federal bench." Ethan did not offer a reassuring nod. He did not extend professional courtesy. He simply stood at the base of the raised platform, flanked by his federal protective detail, and offered a terrifyingly serene smile. It was the expression of a predator observing a trapped animal thrashing against the bars of a cage. Ethan understood the strict ethical boundaries of his new office. A judge cannot issue threats. A judge cannot engage in petty personal vindictiveness. Therefore, Ethan utilized the most devastating weapon available to him. He utilized undeniable public facts. "It is a pleasure to finally see you again, Spencer," Ethan said. His voice projected clearly across the silent ballroom, carrying no trace of anger or malice. "I appreciate your dedication to the legal process. I look forward to serving the District of Utah." Ethan shifted his gaze, moving past the crumbling politician to lock eyes with the true architect of my exile. My father stood near the center of the head table. Warren Sanders built his identity on the premise that he was the smartest, most untouchable man in any room. He accumulated wealth by crushing his opponents and exploiting every available loophole. He looked down at Ethan, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo jacket. The arrogant sneer he usually wore was gone, replaced by a rigid, wide-eyed stare. "It is good to see you too, Warren," Ethan continued, his tone remaining polite and conversational. "I understand the federal courts in this region are quite busy right now. The docket is particularly heavy with commercial land use disputes." Ethan let the sentence hang in the air. He did not elaborate. He did not point a finger. He allowed the silence to stretch, giving my father the necessary space to connect the dots on his own. I watched the realization hit my father. It was a visible, agonizing process. Warren knew his entire real estate portfolio hinged on a pending federal lawsuit regarding his illegal construction on protected wetlands. He knew that the case fell under the jurisdiction of the United States District Court for the District of Utah. He stared into Ethan's calm, unyielding eyes, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The young attorney he once mocked as a terrible investment, the man he banished to the freezing streets, now possessed the absolute judicial authority to dismantle his empire. Ethan was not just a judge. He was a peer among the magistrates who would decide the fate of the Sanders legacy. The revelation struck Warren with the force of a physical blow. His knees buckled. He stumbled backward, his calves hitting the edge of his velvet-upholstered chair. He collapsed into the seat. His hands trembled as they rested on the pristine white tablecloth. The patriarch of the family looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. The illusion of his omnipotence shattered into dust. The power dynamic of the room tilted permanently. The guests watching the exchange began to piece together the history between the judge and the disgraced developer. Whispers erupted among the tables. The elite crowd realized that aligning with Warren Sanders was no longer a strategic advantage. It was a profound liability. Desperation breeds predictable behavior. When the foundation crumbles, those who rely on appearances will always attempt to paint over the cracks. Lorraine realized her husband and her son-in-law were incapacitated by shock. She stepped off the raised dais, her burgundy silk gown rustling against the hardwood floor. She arranged her features into a mask of overwhelming joy, her eyes wide with manufactured warmth. She relied on the social conditioning of the country club, assuming that polite etiquette could erase 5 years of targeted cruelty. She walked briskly toward Ethan, extending both of her arms in a gesture of maternal affection. "Ethan," she cried out, her voice bright and melodic, cutting through the tense atmosphere. "What an incredible surprise! We had no idea you received such a prestigious appointment. Welcome to the family." She moved in for the embrace, preparing to wrap her arms around his shoulders and claim his victory as her own. She wanted the room to see a unified, loving reunion. She needed the influential guests to believe that the new federal judge was an ally of the Sanders household. Ethan did not flinch. He did not raise his hands to defend himself. He simply took one precise, deliberate step backward. The movement was slight, but the rejection was profound. Lorraine froze mid-stride, her arms suspended awkwardly in the empty space between them. Her fake smile wavered, the corners of her mouth trembling as she struggled to maintain the charade. "I am not here to join the family, Mrs. Sanders," Ethan said quietly. The polite conversational tone was gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable boundary. "I am just here to escort my wife home." He turned his back on my mother, dismissing her entirely. He walked back to my dim corner, offering his arm to me. I stood up from the uneven wooden chair. I smoothed the front of my gray cashmere sweater. The air in the room felt different now. It was lighter, cleared of the toxic pressure I had carried for half a decade. The invisible chains my family used to bind me to their expectations were severed. I looked at the faces of the people who had mocked me, ignored me, and prayed for my poverty. They were staring at me with a mixture of awe and terror. I was no longer the discarded scapegoat. I was the wife of a federal judge standing in the ashes of their ruined kingdom. I slipped my hand through Ethan's arm, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of his presence. The victory was ours, earned through silent endurance and unbreakable discipline. However, I was not quite ready to walk out the door. The patriarch and the politician were neutralized, but the golden child still owed a debt. I turned my attention back toward the head table, preparing to settle my final account. The silence in the grand banquet hall was no longer just an absence of sound. It felt like a physical entity, a heavy pressure pressing against the chests of every guest in the room. I stood beside my husband, my hand resting securely in the crook of his arm. The thick wool of his bespoke suit felt rough and grounding beneath my fingertips. We had effectively paralyzed the most arrogant men in Utah without raising our voices or issuing a single threat. The wealthy spectators gathered around the pristine white tables watched us with wide, unblinking eyes trapped in the gravitational pull of a sudden and devastating shift in power. We could have walked out the door right then. We had won. The patriarch was terrified, and the politician was rapidly calculating his own legal demise. Yet my personal ledger was not quite balanced. My father and my brother-in-law were neutralized, but the golden child remained standing. I released the arm of my husband and reached into my unbranded leather bag. I withdrew my smartphone. Up on the elevated dais, Audrey stood frozen next to her panicked husband. Her emerald designer gown, which had sparkled so triumphantly earlier in the evening, now looked like a costume she no longer knew how to wear. Her flawless complexion had turned a sickly shade of gray. She watched me hold up my phone, her eyes darting nervously around the room, searching for a lifeline that did not exist. For her entire life, Audrey relied on our parents to shield her from the consequences of her actions. She assumed her status as the favored daughter granted her immunity from the rules that governed ordinary people. She believed she could steal my intellectual property, pass it off as her own brilliance, to secure a coveted board seat, and simply walk away. She severely underestimated the architect she decided to rob. I did not march up to the head table to confront her. I did not scream or demand an apology. I simply unlocked my screen, opened my messaging application, and tapped her name. I pasted a unique encrypted uniform resource locator into the text field. I pressed send. A sharp synthetic chime pierced the dead quiet of the ballroom. The notification sound echoed from the small metallic clutch resting on the table directly in front of Audrey. She flinched as if the noise had physically struck her. She looked down at her designer purse, then looked back up at me, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. "Go ahead," I said, my voice carrying a calm, conversational tone that reached every corner of the silent hall. Open it. Audrey hesitated. Her hand shook as she unclasped the brass hardware of her evening bag and pulled out her phone. The bright blue light from her screen illuminated her pale face in the dim ballroom. She tapped the notification. I watched her expression shift as the digital dashboard loaded on her device. I had directed my corporate attorneys to construct a live interactive legal portal specifically for this exact moment. Right now, Audrey was staring at the official logo of Vanguard Data. Beneath that logo sat the formal draft of an impending corporate lawsuit detailing the exact statutes she violated regarding intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, and fraudulent misrepresentation. The damages listed in bold black font totaled $20 million. But the lawsuit was not the only item displayed on her screen. Embedded directly in the center of the legal portal was a high-definition video file. It began to play silently on her device. I knew exactly what she was watching. She was viewing herself, standing on the stage at the Grand America Hotel, proudly pitching my proprietary healthcare algorithms to a room full of wealthy donors. She was watching undeniable, time-stamped proof of her own fraud. A choked, desperate gasp escaped her lips. Audrey scrolled further down the page, her frantic thumb swiping across the glass. She reached the bottom of the document, where the ownership structure of Vanguard Data was clearly outlined. She read the name of the anonymous primary donor who funded her beloved charity gala. She read the name of the founder and chief executive officer she had stolen from. She read my name. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. The destitute, discarded sister she mocked all evening was the invisible billionaire tech founder holding her entire future in the palm of her hand. The crushing weight of the financial liability and the impending public humiliation broke her pristine facade. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her dark eyelashes and carving wet, ruined tracks through her expensive makeup. She covered her mouth with her trembling hand, letting out a jagged, wretched sob. The golden child was reduced to a weeping, broken shell, mourning the sudden death of her fabricated reputation. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my handbag. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her comfort. I simply turned my back on the elevated dais and walked toward the dark corner of the room where my evening began. The guests tracked my every movement. I reached my designated seat at the tiny, unsteady overflow table near the swinging kitchen doors. I reached down toward the uneven wooden leg. My fingers brushed against the familiar texture of the folded paper I had wedged there an hour ago. I gripped the edge of the document and pulled it free. Without the makeshift wedge to stabilize it, the small circular table immediately dropped a quarter of an inch. The sudden tilt caused the silverware to clatter loudly against the porcelain plates. The rattling sound served as a fitting metaphor for the evening. I had removed my support, and their uneven foundation was finally collapsing. I turned around holding the crisp paper in my right hand and walked back up the center aisle. I ascended the 3 carpeted steps to the raised platform. The power brokers seated at the head table recoiled slightly, pressing their backs against their velvet chairs as I approached. I stopped directly in front of my father. Warren sat slumped in his seat, his broad shoulders hunched forward. He looked like an aging, defeated general surveying the ruins of a lost campaign. He did not meet my eyes. He stared blankly at his untouched dinner, his chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow bursts. I held the folded document over his pristine white china plate. I let go. The paper fluttered down, landing softly on top of his roasted elk. It unfolded slightly, revealing the bold black ink of a bank wire transfer receipt. It was the time-stamped documentation of the $150,000 trust fund he stole from me. It clearly displayed his signature authorizing the fraudulent transfer, alongside the routing numbers directing my inheritance straight into his son-in-law's political action committee. "Keep the charity, Dad," I said. My voice was stripped of all emotion, delivering the final blow with clinical precision. "I do not need the money." But the Federal Election Commission might have a few questions about undisclosed illegal proxy donations. The words hung in the frigid air, carrying profound legal consequences. Standing a few feet away, Spencer absorbed the impact of my statement. He understood campaign finance law. He knew that accepting a funneled, stolen trust fund to finance his political ambitions was a severe federal crime. The revelation that the paper trail existed and that the wife of a sitting federal judge possessed the receipts was the fatal strike. His exploratory gubernatorial committee was dead. His career was over. The threat of federal prison now loomed directly over his head. The remaining color drained from Spencer's face. His fingers went entirely numb. The crystal champagne glass he had been gripping for the last 10 minutes slipped from his sweaty hand. It fell in slow motion, hitting the polished hardwood floorboard. The delicate crystal shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The sharp, explosive sound of breaking glass echoed throughout the silent banquet hall, finalizing the destruction of the Sanders family legacy. I looked at the three of them. My sister was weeping uncontrollably, facing a devastating intellectual property lawsuit. My brother-in-law was staring at the shattered glass, realizing his political future was bound for a federal indictment. My father was staring at the undeniable proof of his own corruption, knowing the judge who would oversee his ruination was standing right behind me. I had systematically dismantled the golden child, the politician, and the ruthless patriarch in less than 2 minutes. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not beg for their understanding or their love. I simply presented them with the documented facts of their own choices and let the consequences crush them. I turned away from the head table for the final time. I walked down the carpeted steps and rejoined my husband. Ethan looked at me, a profound, quiet pride radiating from his dark eyes. He offered his arm. I linked my arm through his, feeling the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart against my side. Together, we walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. The sea of politicians and developers parted for us, offering a wide, respectful berth. We did not look back at the tears or the shattered crystal. We pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the crisp, freezing mountain air, leaving the wreckage of their kingdom far behind us. The heavy oak doors of the ski lodge closed behind us with a muffled thud, sealing the chaos inside. The crisp winter air filled my lungs, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and impending snow. I stood on the frozen driveway for a brief moment, looking up at the dark, starless sky spanning across the Wasatch Mountains. The suffocating pressure I had carried in my chest for 5 long years dissipated, evaporating into the freezing night. Ethan gently squeezed my hand. We walked down the sweeping circular driveway toward our waiting vehicle, leaving the frantic whispers and shattered crystal far behind us. We climbed into the heated cabin of the armored utility vehicle. The engine purred with quiet efficiency. Ethan steered us away from the glittering, status-obsessed enclave of Park City, guiding the car down the winding canyon road toward the valley. The descent felt highly symbolic. We were leaving the realm of inherited vanity and returning to the gritty, merit-based world we conquered on our own terms. We drove in comfortable silence. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt provided a soothing soundtrack to our victory. I rested my head against the leather seat, watching the city lights emerge through the darkness. We had built an empire in the shadows, and we had just detonated a flawless, bloodless strike. The ensuing 6 months delivered a relentless cascade of poetic justice. The wheels of the American legal system often grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Ethan took his seat on the federal bench that spring. However, he did not preside over my father's environmental land use lawsuit. On his very first day in chambers, Ethan filed an immediate and formal ethical recusal, citing a clear, undeniable conflict of interest. He handed the sprawling case over to a visiting magistrate from a neighboring federal district. That reassigned judge possessed a reputation for unyielding strictness and owed zero political favors to the Utah elite. Without the ability to leverage his local connections or bribe municipal officials, my father faced the unvarnished reality of his crimes. The trial exposed a decade of forged zoning permits and deliberate ecological destruction. The federal court ruled against Sanders' commercial properties, imposing staggering financial penalties. The court mandated astronomical asset forfeitures to cover the cost of environmental restoration. The very commercial real estate empire my father used to crush his competitors, the same weapon he wielded to sabotage my first office lease in Lehi, ultimately caused his ruin. His primary holding companies filed for bankruptcy. By late autumn, a prominent bank foreclosed on the sprawling limestone mansion where I was once pushed out into the snow. My brother-in-law experienced a similarly swift downfall. Spencer never filed his official paperwork to run for the governor's office. The time-stamped bank receipt I dropped onto that pristine white tablecloth triggered an immediate inquiry. The Federal Election Commission frowns heavily upon undisclosed proxy donations sourced from stolen trust funds. His campaign war chest was frozen, pending a comprehensive audit. His wealthy political allies vanished overnight, scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a looming federal indictment. Spencer resigned from his current municipal positions and retreated from public life entirely. His arrogant political dreams reduced to ash. Audrey fared no better. My corporate attorneys at Vanguard Data executed their instructions without mercy. The intellectual property lawsuit proceeded with lethal efficiency. Facing a devastating public trial that would bankrupt her remaining assets, Audrey signed a crippling settlement agreement. The legal stipulations forced her to publicly retract her gala presentation and formally resign from the philanthropic board she so desperately coveted. The Salt Lake City elite value flawless reputations above all else. Once exposed as a fraud and a thief, my sister became a social outcast. Her expensive designer gowns stayed locked in her closet. The invitations to exclusive country club luncheons stopped arriving in her mailbox. She was left alone with her vanity stripped of the audience she needed to survive. A toxic family system relies entirely on the designated scapegoat to absorb their failures and maintain their fragile equilibrium. When their kingdom collapsed, my parents and my sister instinctively reached out for the person they had spent a lifetime training to fix their problems. My phone began to ring incessantly. Dozens of voicemails filled my digital inbox. My mother wept on the recordings, her voice trembling with manufactured panic, pleading for a reconciliation and hinting at a financial loan to save their estate. My father sent lengthy emails, promising to finally treat me as an equal partner in a restructured business venture. Audrey texted me photographs from our childhood, attempting to leverage a nostalgic bond that never truly existed. They did not offer genuine apologies for their cruelty. They did not take accountability for their theft or their emotional abuse. They merely wanted access to my capital. They viewed my newly discovered wealth as a life raft, expecting me to throw them a line while they were drowning in the consequences of their own actions. I sat by the dark steel fireplace in my secluded mountain home, listening to their frantic voicemails. The flames cast warm light across the polished concrete floors. I felt no guilt. I felt no lingering obligation to save them. The trauma bond was permanently severed. I drove down to the local cellular provider the next morning and changed my phone number. I instructed my cybersecurity team to block their email addresses across all corporate and personal servers. I severed the final digital threads tying me to their sinking ship, embracing the profound peace of true, impenetrable boundaries. If you are watching this video and you recognize your own life in my story, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Narcissistic family structures operate on a strict, unspoken hierarchy. They designate a golden child to project their idealized image to the world. They rely on enablers to maintain the illusion, and they select a scapegoat to carry the burden of their secret dysfunction. They target you because you possess the empathy, the strength, and the clear vision they lack. They punish you because you refuse to pretend that their toxic behavior is normal. They try to convince you that you are broken, unworthy, and destined for failure, hoping you will internalize their lies and remain trapped under their control. You must understand that their rejection has nothing to do with your inherent value. It has everything to do with their profound insecurities. They diminish your light because it exposes their shadows. You do not have to prove your worth to people who are stubbornly committed to misunderstanding you. You do not owe your loyalty to a bloodline that treats you like a disposable asset. Walking away from your family is one of the most agonizing decisions a person can make. But sometimes it is the only way to save your own life. Stop arguing with them. Stop trying to translate your pain into a language they refuse to learn. Conserve your energy. Channel your grief into your ambition. Build your empire in total silence. Cultivate your mind, nurture your talents, and gather your receipts. Let them believe you are defeated. Let them enjoy their temporary delusions of grandeur, because one day the truth will catch up to them. And when that day arrives, you will not need to raise your voice to tear down their kingdom. You will simply stand in the undeniable light of your own achievements. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not a screaming match or a bitter confrontation. The ultimate revenge is letting your success speak so loudly they can never again pretend they do not hear it. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If this story resonated with your own struggles, or if it gave you the courage to finally set a boundary you have been afraid to enforce, please share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment below telling me your thoughts, and join our community. Your worth is undeniable. Build your beautiful life, and I will see you in the next story. We raise our children in the shadows of the monuments we build to our own egos. In the grand tapestry of American culture, particularly within the traditional family structure, there is a dangerous and pervasive myth. The belief that providing a roof, a prestigious surname, and a financial inheritance is the ultimate fulfillment of parental duty. We are conditioned to measure the success of our parenting by the external metrics of our children's achievements, the colleges they attend, and the wealth they marry into. But as the story of Paige Sanders so devastatingly reveals, when we commodify our children into extensions of our own vanity, we do not build a family legacy. We build a gilded cage. And inevitably, we force our strongest children to break the bars just to survive. Reflecting on the ashes of the Sanders family empire, the most profound lesson is not merely about corporate revenge or the triumph of an underdog. It is a harrowing, urgent masterclass in the failures of modern parenting. Warren and Lorraine Sanders possessed every conceivable resource to nurture a thriving, connected family. Yet they lacked the most fundamental currency of parenthood: emotional awareness. They operated their home not as a sanctuary of unconditional love, but as a ruthless corporate boardroom where affection was a dividend paid only for strict compliance. In traditional American households, there is often a heavy emphasis on loyalty and respect for the patriarch or matriarch. We are taught that blood is thicker than water, that family is an unbreakable bond demanding our endless sacrifice. But Paige's journey exposes the dark underbelly of this societal norm. When parents demand respect without offering honesty, and when they demand loyalty while actively sabotaging their child's independence, they distort the very concept of family responsibility. True family responsibility does not mean manipulating a child's trust fund to finance a political campaign. Nor does it mean digitally erasing a daughter from a Christmas card to preserve a flawless country club aesthetic. Responsibility is the quiet, unglamorous work of honoring a child's inherent worth, even and especially when their path diverges from the one you curated for them. The dynamic between Paige and her sister Audrey serves as a tragic indictment of unfairness in child rearing. The golden child and scapegoat dichotomy is a poison that destroys sibling relationships from the root. By shielding Audrey from consequence and rewarding her imitation Warren and Lorraine did not protect their favored daughter. They crippled her. They raised a woman so dependent on external validation and unearned status that she resorted to intellectual theft to maintain her fragile identity. Conversely, by discarding Paige into the freezing Utah snow, they inadvertently forged a titan. This presents a terrifying paradox for anyone raising children today. The Sanders parents destroyed their family, not by failing to provide, but by providing conditionally. They lacked the emotional intelligence to recognize that a child's defiance is often their most valuable survival trait. Long-term guidance does not mean paving a frictionless road of nepotism for your children. It means equipping them with the moral compass to navigate the wilderness on their own. It requires a commitment to fairness that transcends your own comfort, and a dedication to honesty that forces you to admit when you, as the parent, are wrong. Warren and Lorraine's inability to apologize, their refusal to see their daughter as anything other than a bad investment, was the fatal flaw that brought a federal judge to their doorstep. There is a strange, unsettling beauty in Paige's ultimate victory, and it is a story we must actively pass down to remind ourselves of the power of boundaries. If you have ever felt the cold sting of being the black sheep, or if you are navigating the complex, beautiful, and sometimes agonizing journey of raising children in a world that values optics over authenticity, you are not alone. We share these narratives because there is healing in the light of truth. I invite you to subscribe and follow Zara Told Stories, where we continue to explore the raw, unfiltered realities of family survival and the quiet triumphs of the human spirit. Join our community because the stories we consume shape the families we ultimately build. As we look at the wreckage of the Park City Anniversary Gala, a lingering, uncomfortable ambiguity remains. We cheer for Paige as she walks out into the crisp mountain air, her arm linked with Ethan's, her hidden empire finally stepping into the light. But does the vindication ever truly erase the chill of that January night when a father locked his daughter out in the snow? Can a multi-million-dollar valuation or the gavel of a federal judge ever fill the specific hollow ache left by a mother who prayed for your failure? Perhaps the answer is no. Perhaps we never truly escape the shadow of the parents who broke us. We merely learn to build our own castles using the very stones they threw at us. We carry the ghosts of our childhoods into our boardrooms, our courtrooms, and our own living rooms. This leads us to a truth that society desperately tries to ignore. a viewpoint that goes against every sentimental greeting card and traditional holiday special. We are told from birth that forgiveness is mandatory, that keeping the family together is the highest moral good, and that time heals all wounds. But it doesn't. The conventional wisdom insists that we must always leave the door open for toxic bloodlines simply because they are blood. The profound unconventional reality is this: estrangement is not a failure of love. It is the ultimate manifestation of self-respect. Loyalty to a toxic family is not a virtue. It is a slow, generational suicide. Sometimes, the most beautiful and responsible thing you can do for your future and for the children you will one day raise is to let the bridge burn. You do not owe your life to the people who gave you breath only to try and suffocate you. True peace is not found in the apologies of those who broke you. It is found in the absolute, unshakable realization that you never needed them to survive in the first place.